Jerusalem in 175 BC felt like a city holding its breath. Dawn's rosy light crept across stone walls scarred by years of occupation, but it illuminated more than just weathered masonry. It revealed banners emblazoned with Greek gods flapping defiantly above the temple gates, a stark proclamation that the sacred grounds now lay under foreign decree. The morning air carried the scent of smoke from sacrificial fires, but these were no longer the sweet incense offerings of old. Soldiers enforced rituals unknown to the law of Moses, and the altar's stones still bore the stain of pigs sacrificed in mockery of Israel's covenant. If you're as eager as we are to uncover how ordinary people rekindled hope in those dark days, give this video a thumbs up now. It only takes a second, and it helps others find this story too. In the narrow lanes of the old city, shadows moved with trepidation. Priests, once confident in their ceremonial robes, now wiped trembling hands on their garments before lifting the sacrificial lamb. Their eyes darted toward patrols of armed men clad in Hellenistic armor. Behind them, mothers pressed infants to their chests, whispering silent prayers as they passed shuttered shops where Torah scrolls once lay open for all to read. Fathers gathered bundles of dried figs and olive oil for hidden ceremonies, fearful that even the smallest trace of devotion could earn them imprisonment or worse. Across the Kidron Valley, whispered conversations took place under olive trees. Scholars huddled with students in dim corners of synagogues that had long been centers of learning and worship. Now these hallowed walls felt vulnerable, as if the stones themselves might betray the faithful. The edict was clear: no circumcisions, no Sabbath gatherings, no reading of the law. To defy it was to invite death. And yet, in the hushed hush of secret study circles, the words of Moses and the prophets burned brighter than ever. Don't miss a single moment of these hidden gatherings. Subscribe and ring the notification bell, so you'll be first to join every clandestine prayer and daring act of faith. In the opulent halls of the royal palace, Antiochus IV of Epiphanes reclined on a gilded couch, sipping wine and marveling at the sight of priests forced to trample their own traditions. He took perverse pleasure in seeing venerable scholars barter scroll fragments for safety. His decrees had banished Jewish festivals, banned the Hebrew tongue in public forums, and installed pagan shrines in the most sacred precincts of the temple. With a sneer, he declared that loyalty belonged not to one god, but to the king who held the might of empire in his hand. Yet beneath this veneer of dominance, an undercurrent of outrage was growing. In the marketplaces where merchants once called out the quality of their produce, conversations turned from bargaining over grain to plotting acts of defiance. Youths carved secret symbols in doorposts. Women hid oil jars for the lighting of forbidden candles. Elders recited psalms by firelight in secluded rooms. Each act of rebellion was small: a blessing spoken in a breath, a loaf of bread broken in sacred remembrance. But together they fanned the embers of resistance into a quiet, smoldering flame. If you feel that spark of courage stirring in your heart, leave a comment below and tell us which act of defiance inspires you most. Then came the moment that changed everything. In Modin, a priest named Mattathias heard the clarion call of conscience. When a Seleucid officer demanded he sacrifice to a heathen god, Mattathias flung aside his ephod, seized his sword, and struck the first blow for freedom. His cry, "Whoever is for the Lord, follow me," echoed through the hills and into history. His bold stand rallied farmers, shepherds, and fellow priests to his side, and together they slipped into the Judean hills, ready to risk everything rather than abandon their faith. That single act of defiance ignited the Maccabean Revolt, and eventually the miracle of Hanukkah. But this story is more than ancient history. It's a testament to the power of conviction, the resilience of community, and the way one brave choice can light the path for generations. If you're moved by their courage, please share this video with a friend who needs encouragement today. And don't forget, every like and share helps keep the flame of this incredible story burning bright. May your own faith be kindled as we continue this journey together. A heavy silence descended on Jerusalem the moment Antiochus IV Epiphanes issued his edict, an edict that turned holy ground into a battlefield of the soul. Under the blinding Levantine sun, soldiers marched into the temple courtyard, their polished helms catching sparks of light that danced unsettlingly on the worn stones. They carried with them idols of Greek deities, statues of Zeus and Dionysus, carved from ivory and gold, their features uncanny and alien in the shadow of the sacred altar. With arrogant precision, they placed these graven images atop the very stones where incense had once risen in prayer. Mace-bearing guards flanked the priests, arms crossed as if daring them to resist. In that moment, centuries of reverence and ritual were trampled beneath foreign boots. The first blow to Jewish identity was the order to sacrifice on that desecrated altar. Priests stood frozen in their linen robes, eyes wide with disbelief, as the high-ranking officer barked commands in a tongue they scarcely understood. "Offer swine in the name of the king," he thundered, and his voice echoed off the marble walls like an accusation against every faithful heart in the city. Some priests recoiled, pressing trembling hands to their mouths. Others obeyed, lifting blades stained by blood, unable to look away as an unclean animal, abomination under the law, fell where the Lamb of Atonement once bled. The cry that rose was not just the animals. It was the breaking of a covenant, and it cut through the air like a sword. As the desecration continued, Antiochus's agents moved swiftly to outlaw the practices that defined Jewish life. In every town and village under his control, soldiers posted proclamations. Circumcision, once the sign of Abraham's everlasting promise, was now a capital crime. Girls and boys who bore the mark of their covenant could be seized by patrolling mercenaries and dragged before tribunals where verdicts were rendered without mercy. Mothers hid their infants in dark cisterns and dug trenches in the earth, desperate to protect a child's flesh from the knife that symbolized a promise older than all empires. Fathers, stoic and silent, carved new symbols of faith in the lintels of their homes, so that even if they failed, their children might one day remember who they were. But the ban on circumcision was only the beginning. Torah scrolls, those sacred parchments painstakingly copied letter by generations of scribes, became targets of imperial fury. In town squares, soldiers heaped bundles of scrolls onto pyres and set them ablaze. Flames curled around the leather and parchment, curling fine ash and smoke that choked the wind with the odor of destruction. Onlookers wept as verses that had guided their prayers and lives curled into embers. No longer could the faithful gather in daylight to chant the Shema. No longer could the words of Moses and the prophets sustain them through hardship. The scroll's destruction felt like the smashing of their own souls. Every time a scroll burned, rage flared in hidden hearts, but so did fear. Under cover of darkness, rabbis and scholars smuggled fragments away, burying them under olive trees or concealing them in the hollow of ancient cisterns. Small pockets of resistance formed. In one cave, 2 elders recited lines of Deuteronomy by torchlight. In another, a group of women wove the letters of Leviticus into the hems of their skirts, so that each step became a whispered prayer. These acts were tiny, almost invisible, but they planted the seeds of defiance in villages from Joppa to Jericho. Meanwhile, Antiochus's agents roamed unchecked, supervising the replacement of Sabbath rest with festivals to the Greek gods. The temple calendar, once anchored by Passover and Sukkot, was rewritten to honor Dionysian revelries. Men and women were conscripted into wild dances, plant wrappings of ivy and grapevines in their hair. Priests who refused were dragged onto platforms and scourged before crowds that cheered at the spectacle, as if tragedy could become entertainment. Every drumbeat echoed like a death knell for tradition, every drunken shout a mockery of covenant fidelity. In the countryside, the response was as diverse as the terrain. In the lush fields of Galilee, farmers abandoned their plows and met in secret groves, forming study circles by moonlight to memorize psalms and commandments. In the arid hills of Judea, herdsmen laid down their staffs and took up stones, practicing the slingshot in preparation for an unknown uprising. Small clusters of women formed prayer chains, passing olive oil from one to the next, anointing doorposts with a hidden blessing that proclaimed, "The Lord is our God." With each covert act, fear and defiance intertwined, galvanizing communities that had long been silenced. Children felt the weight of this provocation too. They heard whispered conversations in the darkness of their homes, caught sight of their parents covering the menorah with cloth when soldiers passed by. Some escaped into caves where wandering rabbis taught them secret hymns. Others learned to carve tiny menorahs into fragments of bone or clay, tangible reminders that a light might yet shine in the gloom. These lessons, passed in silence from generation to generation, forged an identity that no edict could erase. Across these landscapes of fear and hope, the resolve hardened. Conversations once confined to hidden corners grew bolder. In a courtyard in Modine, a group of worshippers defied the ban and read from a Torah scroll stashed beneath a floorboard. Word spread that these gatherings were taking place like sparks in dry brush, small but fierce. In each gathering, the flame of covenant loyalty burned brighter, until it could no longer be contained by subterranean whispers or passwords exchanged at secret knockings. Amid this crucible of oppression, a priest named Mattathias heard the intolerable commands echo through his town. He watched as local elders buckled under pressure, officiating at the new pagan rites to save their own skins. With a fury born of righteous wrath, he seized his sword and cleaved through both officer and altar. His cry, "Whoever is for the Lord, follow me," sliced through the silence like a clarion call. Instantly, the scattered embers of resistance leapt to life, uniting disparate groups under a single banner of defiance. From that moment, the desecration of the temple and the outlawing of sacred rites did more than break hearts. They forged a common identity, a sharpened resolve that rejoiced not in mere survival, but in the fierce joy of covenant fidelity. The oppressor's attempts to extinguish the flame of faith only deepened its glow, teaching the people that divine promises endure beyond the written word, beyond any empire's decree. In the crucible of desecration and banned rites, a revolution was born, one that would reclaim the temple, sanctify the lampstand, and inspire a festival of lights that endures to this day, reminding every generation that even the darkest orders cannot extinguish the spark of freedom. The sun was just cresting the limestone hills when the first echoes of marching boots reached the quiet streets of Modin. At the center of the village stood its heart, a modest courtyard where a priest named Mattathias had long carried out his duties. His silvered hair fell in wisps around a weathered face, and his eyes, still bright with conviction, surveyed the scene with mounting unease. Word had spread that a Seleucid officer, flanked by armed soldiers, would demand a pagan sacrifice at the altar. For days, villagers whispered prayers that this affront might be a rumor. Now they gathered in tense clusters, clutching their cloaks, exchanging fearful glances as the soldier advanced, sword at his hip, scroll of royal decree in hand. Mattathias, though aged, moved with a dignity born of years devoted to the law. He had watched empires rise and fall, seen the temple desecrated and restored, yet never had his vow been tested like this. Circumstances had forced him to step away from the sanctuary at Jerusalem, to serve in this outlying town where traditions still hum beneath the surface. He knew every line of scripture by heart, had buried the bones of faithful kinsmen, and had tended his flock with gentle guidance. But now before him stood a man who sneered at his heritage and spat on the covenant sealed by Abraham's blood. The soldier unfurled the king's edict and thundered, "Offer sacrifice to Zeus or face death for treason." Silence fell like a shroud. Villagers trembled as priests approached the altar, their hands quivering as they lifted the ousted stones. Mothers pressed children behind doorways. Artisans set aside chisels and hammers. Even the baker halted his morning kneading. Dust swirled in the still air, carrying the scent of burning incense long replaced by the stink of fear. When the officer stepped forward, raising a cruel blade over a trembling lamb, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some priests, trembling with terror, bent their knees in a forced obeisance. Others simply stared at the ground, their hearts pounding as they weighed loyalty to Rome against loyalty to God. Then Mattathias stepped into the circle of tension, his staff in hand. The officer barked, "Priest of Modine, act!" And Mattathias felt the years of burdens and promises converge into a single moment of clarity. He raised his voice, not with anger, but with unwavering resolve. "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the king commands you to sacrifice to his gods, do so." Silence deepened, and with a swift motion, he flung aside his ephod and struck the officer with the blunt end of his staff. The man crumpled, and shock froze the soldiers in place. Mattathias's eyes blazed as he drew his sword, the same blade he had used to carve runes of devotion on temple steps. And he swung with the force of righteous wrath, his cry splitting the morning air. "Whoever is for the Lord, follow me!" That shout shattered fear's grip. Farmers dropped their plows in adjacent fields and snatched up swords passed discreetly from hiding places. Shepherds abandoned their flocks on distant slopes and raced down dry gullies, hearts pounding with dawning hope. Even skeptical priests, shaken by the violence of the command, found courage in Mattathias's fierce gaze. They formed ranks behind him, fists clenched around hilts stained by ancient oil, determined to defend their covenant at any cost. In that instant, a ragtag company, priests, villagers, itinerant traders, shifted from survival to resistance. As they slipped into rocky ravines, their tunics brushing against thorny shrubs, each man felt a surge of unity that words could not capture. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls carved by glacial forces, carrying the rhythm of a nascent army. Mattathias led them to hidden caves where stashes of water and dried figs lay waiting. Here, under flickering torchlight, they swore oaths upon torn scroll fragments and made plans in hushed tones. No battle standards were raised, no trumpet fanfare sounded, only the shared heartbeat of those who refused to bow. Their first skirmishes were small but striking. Under Mattathias's command, they ambushed an isolated patrol, retrieving weapons and carting them back to the caves. Word spread across Judea like wildfire. In Modine, the Covenant's defenders had broken Rome's silence. Farmers carved symbols of victory on olive trunks. Women whispered blessings for the fighters as they passed with armored shields slung over shoulders. Each success, however modest, stoked the flames of determination. Hunger and thirst were endured with stoic prayer. Wounds were tended with oil and bandages, and every sunrise found them more resolute. In those early days, Mattathias's cry, "Whoever is for the Lord, follow me," became a rallying refrain echoing through desert winds and urban alleys alike. It transcended the boundaries of class and profession. Free men and captives released themselves from fear. The rebellion, kindled in a small village courtyard, grew into a beacon of hope. And in that vulnerable moment, before any fortress had fallen or temple gates swung open, a new narrative was written. A narrative of courage that would illuminate the darkest chapters of history and inspire countless generations to stand firm when faith is under siege. Under a pale moon that glanced off jagged rocks, Mattathias and his 5 sons slipped silently from Modine, their cloaks brushing against thorny shrubs and the whisper of their footsteps swallowed by the vastness of the Judean hills. Behind them, the village lights twinkled with anxious hope. Ahead, the landscape stretched wild and untamed, a labyrinth of ravines and ridges perfect for those who would dare to fight tyranny with courage and cunning. Their band was small at first, just a handful of priests, farmers, and shepherds drawn by Mattathias's cry for freedom. But each man carried in his heart the weight of a covenant, written not on tablets of stone, but on the living scroll of memory and promise. They found refuge in a hidden cave ringed by twisted olive trees, its mouth half buried in rubble, so that only those who knew where to look could find it. There, by torchlight, they formed their circle of brotherhood. The sons, John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan, stood shoulder to shoulder with village craftsmen and young men who had never held a sword before. In the wavering glow, Mattathias spoke quietly of ancestral heroes, of Gideon, who with 300 men had triumphed, of Shammah who held a field against a Philistine host, of the prophets who risked their lives to speak truth to power. His words were gentle yet unyielding, forging resolve as much as they ignited it. Then one by one, the recruits stepped forward to swear an oath of loyalty, not to a palace or a commission, but to the Lord and to the people of Israel. Their voices, trembling at first, grew strong as they pledged to defend the covenant and one another, no matter the cost. The next nights became a rhythm of training and planning. Under a sky spattered with stars, the recruits greeted each dawn with silent immersion in cold spring pools hewn from rock. Ritual purification that bound body and spirit to the cause. By day they skirmished with makeshift weapons, wooden swords carved from olive trunks, staves of sturdy wood trimmed to a fighter's grip. Mattathias' sons demonstrated basic parries and strikes, echoing lessons passed down from the temple's armory. The clack of practice steel filled the ravine as each youth learned the rhythm of attack and retreat, the art of striking quickly and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. As muscle memory took hold, they moved to live blades. Metalworkers from nearby villages, blacksmiths accustomed to crafting plowshares and sickles, fell into secrecy, fashioning short swords and thrusting spears to the precise specifications Mattathias requested. Each weapon bore a mark, a stylized cursive shin, the first letter of Shema, reminding the bearers that every blow was struck in the name of God's oneness. By torchlight, the recruits tested their new arms, the flash of polished steel a fierce promise against the Seleucid legions. While arms were honed, strategy sessions played out in hushed tones around a campfire. The rugged terrain offered natural defenses. Narrow passes where a handful of fighters could hold back a platoon, steep escarpments perfect for ambush and retreat, hidden valleys where horses could not follow. Scouts volunteered to slip into nearby villages under cover of darkness, eavesdropping on soldiers' campfire tales or reading the movement of supply wagons. Each fragment of intelligence was stitched into a map drawn on wax-coated parchment, the ravines etched in black line and arrows marking potential strikes. They spoke of the Seleucid garrison at Beth Zur, the supply depot near Emmaus, the main road into Jerusalem, each location a thread in the web they would weave to encircle and dismantle the oppressor's hold. Amid this tactical preparation, the recruits forged bonds that ran deeper than blood. They shared rations of barley cakes and olive oil, passing earthenware jars hand to hand as prayers of thanksgiving rose in the cool night air. They listened to the sonorous hum of the Torah as an elder read from a hidden scroll, tracing the journey from Exodus to conquest, reminding them that God had delivered their ancestors through desert perils and hostile kings. In those sacred readings, the recruits found more than history. They found an invitation to step into a living narrative of redemption and justice. Their first raid was as much a baptism as a military strike. Under a new moon, they struck a lone outpost guarding an olive grove owned by a Seleucid commander. Silent as shadows, the fighters crept through twisted trees, hearts hammering in unison with the drums of distant guards. With a signal, a low whistle, they rushed in, disarming the soldiers before they even had time to draw their swords. No one need die that night. The prisoners were bound and released at dawn, ordered to deliver words of warning to their superiors. The olive grove, now free of unclean levy, became the fighters' initial storehouse for food, each gnarled branch a testament to God's provision. Word of that success soared across the hills, carried by traders and travelers as they moved from village to village. Young men flocked to the caves, trading water skins for swords. Women stitched hidden pouches into cloaks to carry messages. Elders carved symbols of encouragement on doorposts. Everyone who came added something to the cause: provisions, healing herbs, news of troop movements. The Maccabean band, once a ragtag group, swelled with a humble confidence, each new recruit a living affirmation that the covenant's promise was stronger than the decrees of kings. As their numbers grew, training intensified. They practiced night marches, stepping quietly over hilltops, learning to read the heavens for travel cues. They simulated ambushes on mock supply wagons, two fighters posing as soldiers, others circling from concealed ridges to cut off retreat. Each drill sharpened nerves and honed coordination, yet underscored the principle that they were fighting not for glory, but for the sanctity of faith and community. No one spoke of rank. Every man who took up arms did so as an equal before the covenant. When the Seleucid general learned of the band's existence, he scoffed at the notion that a few desert fighters could challenge an empire's force. His soldiers marched out, confident of easy victory, but the Maccabees, in their intimate knowledge of the hills, materialized like phantoms, striking supply lines and vanishing before forced marches could outflank them. Each clash reinforced the lesson Mattathias had taught. Warfare is as much about the mind and heart as it is about steel. Courage bolstered by community, faith tempered by strategy. This combination proved more potent than the enemy's mightiest phalanx. Winter arrived with bitter winds that howled through hidden valleys. By day, the fighters sought shelter in caves thick with stalactites. By night, they huddled near small hearths, shielding their faces from frost. Water froze in their flasks, and rations dwindled, yet the band endured. Mattathias' eldest son reminded them that the valley's barrenness tested their resolve, just as the wilderness had tested their ancestors. They spoke of Elijah's endurance in Moses' provision. They recited psalms that spoke of God as shield and safe refuge in storm. Those words lent them warmth no fire could kindle. Under the austere beauty of frosted cliffs, the brother leaders, John's steady counsel, Simon's quiet encouragement, Judah's fearless zeal, guided the band through harsh nights and daring strikes. They dispersed swiftly to harass outposts and regrouped under hidden arches at dawn. Each operation was small in scale, but mighty in message, a reminder that justice is not measured by size of force, but by size of heart and will. When spring's first buds appeared, the hillsides burst with color, and the band emerged stronger. Now, numbering in the hundreds, they could contemplate bold moves, rescuing captives, recapturing outposts, and preparing to march on Jerusalem itself. Yet even as their confidence soared, they never lost the humility forged in those early ravine trainings. They knew that every victory was a gift, every breath a mercy, and every recruit a bearer of the covenant. In forging the Maccabean band, Mattathias and his sons did more than assemble an army. They rekindled the flame of a people bound by promise. They crafted not just swords, but shared purpose. They wove strategy from scripture, discipline from devotion, and defiance from deep wells of faith. In the dark, secret caves of the Judean hills, they shaped history's course, not through the roar of human armies, but through the steady heartbeat of those who refused to bow. And in that crucible, the revolution that would reclaim the temple and ignite an enduring festival of light was born. When Judah the Maccabee took command of his fledgling army, he inherited more than swords and sandals. He inherited a quiet resolve honed by months of hardship and clandestine training. From the jagged crest of the Jesse Ridge, he surveyed the patchwork of valleys below, dotted with olive groves and shepherds' huts where Seleucid patrols still moved with casual arrogance. He knew that his strength lay not in numbers or heavy armor, but in the terrain itself, the quicksilver unity of his men, and the element of surprise. In those hills, every twisted olive trunk and narrow goat track could become the fulcrum of freedom. Before each mission, Judah gathered his captains in a hollow beneath a stunted oak. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on determined faces as they studied crudely drawn maps scratched into leather. They marked the positions of outposts, a stone watchtower guarding a watering hole, a garrison quartered in a ruined fortress, a supply caravan that passed a bend in the road every fortnight. From these humble sketches, Judah wove tactics that would confound an army 10 times their size. He stressed swift movement, precise timing, and absolute cohesion. Each man was to strike as part of a living blade, then vanish before the enemy could muster reply. One of their first operations targeted the garrison at En-Gedi, where soldiers guarded cisterns who controlled the water supply to a wide swath of villages. Before dawn, Judah led 50 men down a slope slick with dew, their tread muffled by cloaks and the hush of anticipation. As the sun's first light blushed the horizon, They paused at the lip of an olive grove that spilled toward the cistern's low walls. In disciplined silence, they flanked the guardhouse. A left wing crept along a terrace of vines, while a right wing abandoned the cover of tangled briars to circle behind. At the appointed signal, a sharp whistle in Aramaic, they sprang. The sentry, startled from his doze, barely had time to raise his sword before the Maccabees were upon him. In under a minute, 2 prisoners stood bound. The cistern's gates were broken open, and the warriors withdrew with skins full of water and hearts full of confidence. That night, across Judea's windswept hills, news of Ein Gedi's liberation traveled by word of mouth. Villagers opened their doors to the returning fighters, offering bread and goat's milk in hushed gratitude. Children pressed close to touch the polished blades, and grandmothers wept for the first time in weeks, their faith rekindled by the belief that God had not abandoned his people. With each small victory, Judah's band swelled in numbers and in spirit, as men who had once carved nooses of despair now found themselves girded for battle. Their next raid involved a supply convoy carrying grain from Samaria to the fortress at Joppa. Intelligence had revealed its route along a narrow pass, flanked by steep, unscalable cliffs. Before dawn, Judah ordered 40 riders to take position above the path, camouflaged against rocky ledges. Below, 10-foot soldiers knelt in wait, hidden in a thicket of bramble. When the caravan's wagons appeared, oxen plodding under heavy sacks, Judah's riders signaled. From the heights they plunged like hawks, shouting the war cry and brandishing torches. Oxen bolted in terror, wagons overturned, and the Seleucid guards, startled and disordered, found themselves assailed on all sides. The Maccabees moved with preternatural speed, disarming soldiers and seizing grain before reinforcements could arrive. Within moments, the heavy loads were dragged into the hills, ensuring winter rations for the communities that sheltered them. These daring maneuvers chipped away at the Seleucid aura of invincibility. Generals in distant cities scoffed at reports of guerrilla fighters outrunning phalanxes, but every skirmish forced them to divert troops from fortress garrisons to remote passes, stretching their resources thinner. Soldiers returned from hunts for Maccabean bands with haunted eyes, warning of shadows where none should be, of swarms of worshippers turned warriors, of a spirit that no arrow could pierce. With each campaign, Judah refined his tactics. He learned to leave false trails, to scatter his men like dust before reassembling them downwind of an enemy patrol, to signal at night with carved stones that glowed faintly in torchlight. In one episode near the ruins of Beth Zechariah, a detachment of 70 young fighters lay in wait along a shepherd's path. Dust kicked up around approaching cavalry, the horses' hooves flashing as they rounded a bend. Judah's men, concealed in gnarled olive roots, waited in disciplined rows until the mounted guard was directly overhead. Then, at a single command, they sprang forward. Cavalrymen were unhorsed, horses panicked, and riders tumbled amid rocks and olive limbs. When fresh troops arrived, they found empty saddles and abandoned arms. No living foe to capture, no banners to triumph over. The Maccabees had dissolved into the haze of olive canopies as quickly as they had struck. Back in hidden encampments, the fighters divided spoils. Weapons handed to blacksmiths for repair, animals butchered for salt-cured meat, and maps coated with notes that would guide future missions. Every recruit learned from these encounters how to use the sun's arc for travel, how to read tracks in gravel, how to slake thirst from spring water without betraying their position. Even the new recruits, once untested in blood, found themselves absorbing the rhythm of guerrilla warfare as naturally as breathing. In villages liberated by these raids, people hosted clandestine assemblies where Judah's captains lectured on defensive tactics. Women practiced knots to bind arrow shafts. Elders carved whistles to signal when patrols neared. Young boys learned to weave camouflage garments. The resistance became woven into daily life, as ordinary homes transformed into rings of sentinel stations. Outsiders passing through by daylight saw only humble cottages. By night, the same homes became outposts in a living chain of freedom. Judah himself led by example. He rode at the head of every column, his cloak billowing like a banner, his sword raised high in defiance. Yet he never stinted in sharing the men's burden. He broke his own bread in the flickering campfire glow. He softened his voice to teach recruits how to read enemy formations. He knelt to pray beside wounded fighters in hidden gulches. His presence inspired fierce loyalty. No man would desert a general who had fought beside him, sweat alongside him, and comforted him in his darkest hour. By early spring, the pattern of raid and withdrawal had become a nightmare for the Seleucid forces. Commanders scrambled to fortify isolated outposts, draining resources from the very cities Antiochus thought secure. Supplies meant for 6 months dwindled in weeks. Once confident soldiers muttered of ghosts in the hills. Every victory, no matter how small, resonated as a challenge to the empire's might and a vindication of the covenant's promise. The moment Judah's fighters crested the ridge overlooking Jerusalem, their hearts thundered as loudly as the war horns echoing through the pre-dawn air. The city lay before them in ghostly silhouette, ancient ramparts broken in places, watchtowers half ruined, and beneath the walls a scattering of torchlights where the Seleucid garrison still slumbered, or pretended to. For years, the Maccabees had danced on the edges of these defenses, striking and vanishing into the hills. Now, destiny seemed to call them forward for a final reckoning. As dawn's first pale fingers brushed the eastern sky, they descended in disciplined columns, each man gripping sword and shield, each soul afire with a single purpose: to reclaim the temple that had been defiled in the name of tyranny. They reached the base of the wall where the stones had been pried loose by earlier skirmishes. Without hesitation, they hoisted ladders, sturdy beams bound with leather straps, and pressed them against the fractured parapet. The narrow rungs rattled under the weight of determined feet. From above, the Seleucid sentries awakened in alarm, scrambling to repel the assault. But Judah's men leaped onto the ramparts with the swiftness of falcons. A brief clash of steel crackled in the dawn, and then the defenders scattered into side streets, their ordered ranks dissolving under the onslaught of guerrilla fury. Through winding alleys and over sun-warmed stones, the fighters flowed like a tide toward the temple precincts. Smoke still drifted from broken braziers where foreigners had sacrificed housed idols. Shattered fragments of ivory lay amid overturned benches. At the eastern gate, a handful of armored foes tried to stem the tide, but they met the combined force of Judah's captains, Jonathan on the right, Simon on the left, each man moving with the precision of long practice. The clang of metal rang off the temple escarpments as the soldiers fell back, giving way at last to the roar of liberated worshippers clamoring for the sacred courts. When the gates finally yielded, the Maccabees surged into the outer court. The courtyard, once thronged with devout pilgrims, bore the scars of sacrilege. Goat bones littered the flagstones, and a bronze statue of Zeus leered from the base of the altar. Rage burned in every eye as they raised their voices in a cry that echoed off the Syrian-built terraces. "To the temple! To the temple!" They bounded over broken columns, chased desecrated shrines into ruin, and pried loose the idolatrous effigies with fingers stiffened by years of oppression. Each smashed idol was not merely an act of destruction, but a reclaiming of the promise that no foreign god could stand where the Lord God had once dwelt. Inside the Hikal, where priests once presented daily offerings, the scene was more harrowing still. Stone pens that held unclean animals now reeked of death, and the floor was slick with pig's blood that had dripped through the grating above. Judah's own voice rose in a lamentation and a command. "Cleanse the courts, for our God will not dwell in defilement." He stood at the base of the great altar, its surface scarred by desecrating blows, and looked up at the flickering shadows cast by torches brought by advancing fighters. Without hesitation, he grabbed the edge of a tripod brazier and hurled it aside, extinguishing the last embers of that unholy fire. A cheer went up that shook the pillars of the portico, as if the very stones rejoiced at the return of holiness. But the temple had more than idols to remove. It needed renewal. From hidden jars stashed beneath floorboards and behind loose masonry, the faithful produced amphorae of pure oil. small flasks set aside when the Seleucids first imposed their reign. They had hidden these precious vessels at great personal risk, knowing that only fresh oil, hallowed by ritual, could rekindle the eternal flame of the menorah. As men formed a solemn line, passing the jars from trembling hands, Judah lifted the smallest vessel and poured its clear liquid into the lampstand's cups. A hush fell, a collective breath held in anticipation. Then the eldest priest struck a single match against flint, and the wick caught fire with a soft, steady glow. That flame, meant for a single day's light, burned with undimmed brilliance through the second, third, and fourth night. When the priest lit it again on the fifth night, then the sixth, each rekindling was met by rising joy in the hearts of worshipers. Crowds gathered around the temple gates, their torches extinguished so as not to dim this miracle of divine provision. Women wept openly, children danced on the marble steps, and the priests chanted hymns of thanksgiving, songs that echoed even beyond the siege lines, carrying word of this wonder to villages and camps where the fighters prepared for the coming struggle against renewed Seleucid assaults. While the oil burned, Judah and his captains decreed a day of celebration and rededication. They invited every Jew from the hills and valleys to gather in the temple courts. The skilled musicians of Modin resurrected ancient tunes, their kinners and lyres weaving melodies of deliverance. The priests donned restored vestments, robes washed in the purest water, and led the people in a renewed covenant ceremony. Deuteronomic passages were read aloud, recounting God's deliverance from Egypt, and each family renewed the vow whispered by Moses, to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. In that charged atmosphere, they rebuilt the altar of unhewn stones, placing on it the finest wood and fresh coals. The first sacrifice offered was the sin offering, to atone not only for the desecration, but also for the sin of inaction that had allowed defilement to stand so long. As smoke curled upward, mingling with the dawn mist, an unmistakable sense of reconciliation settled over the crowds. No longer were they mere rebels or fugitives. They were a nation once more, standing under a covenant alive with promise. Yet even as the cheers reverberated off the western wall, Judah cautioned restraint. He knew the Seleucid response would not be long in coming. His war council convened in a chamber beneath the Hasmonean palace ruins, where men unmapped their orders and prepared defenses. Khakis of food were laid aside for a fast day in gratitude. Scouts were dispatched to watch the approaches from the north. Every family that rejoiced at the temple's liberation pledged to guard its steps and to tend its burned-out lanterns until peace was assured. As afternoon light bathed the Temple Mount, the fighters returned to their mountain encampments, carrying news of the victory to those who could not come. Along the routes home, villages burst into spontaneous celebrations. Men and women danced under olive trees, carrying torches in a mock procession of triumph. Mothers set their infants on shoulders, teaching them the words for light and freedom. Even in the remote desert settlements, the sight of smoke pillars rising from Jerusalem summoned prayers of praise, reminding every Jew that the Lord indeed watched over the remnant. By the time the Seleucid legions regrouped for a counterattack, they encountered a fortified city brimming with faith. The walls, repaired by citizen volunteers, bristled with defenders. The temple stones, freshly cleansed, stood as a beacon of divine favor. When Antiochus's generals demanded capitulation, their messengers found no elders to negotiate, only warriors whose names were whispered among the hills for their audacity. Each refusal was not merely a rebuff, but a testament. No army could conquer a people united by covenant and fierce belief. In the days that followed, the liberation of the temple served as both a strategic foothold and a spiritual anchor. Pilgrims returned from long exile to renew their vows. Scribes recopied the law with precise care. Families feasted in remembrance of the miracle of oil that burned far beyond expectation. And so Hanukkah was born, a festival not of victory alone, but of divine intervention in the midst of human endeavor. Every year hence, Jews would kindle candles for 8 nights, honoring the blend of faith, courage, and miraculous providence that had restored the temple's light. Through the centuries, when empires again crushed Jewish hopes or scattered their people to foreign lands, the story of that siege and liberation endured. It whispered in hidden gatherings in Babylon, in the study halls of Alexandria, in secret synagogues beneath Roman streets. It reminded each generation that when hands falter and sacrifices falter, when the temple seems forever defiled, a steadfast few can turn the tide, by sword, by prayer, and by the simple act of lighting a lamp against the darkest night. Thus, the Maccabean victory at Jerusalem became more than a military conquest. It became a luminous testament to the power of faith made fierce, a triumph that still kindles light in hearts weary of oppression and longing for liberation. A hush fell over the temple courtyard as the last rays of daylight slipped behind the western wall. The faithful gathered around the charred altar, their faces pale in the glow of torches and oil-lit bowls. Judah's warriors stepped aside to let the priests approach the desecrated lampstand, its cups empty, its wicks long since burned away in days of captivity. An elder priest, his hands trembling with exhaustion and relief, lifted the lid of a clay jar unearthed from a hidden niche beneath the sacred flooring. Inside, untouched by spill or soot, lay a single flask of pure oil, sealed with the emblem of Aaron's house. No one dared breathe aloud. The silent wonder pressed like a prayer on every heart. In that charged stillness, the smallest drop can seem miraculous. A younger priest, steadying the elder's hand, poured the thick liquid into the first cup of the menorah. He struck a flint against steel, and a spark leapt to life on the wick. For a moment, time stood still as the flame caught, flickering like a newborn star. Then it settled into a steady glow that banished the shadows from the carved cherubim above the gates. Murmurs rose among the gathered, a blessing of thanksgiving, a hymn of praise rooted in the Psalms of old, voices trembling with hope that had lain dormant for years. The plan had always been to set that flame, then prepare more consecrated oil for the following day. Yet when morning light filtered through the high windows, the flame still burned. Groggily, soldiers stationed at the southern steps rubbed their eyes, certain someone had replaced the oil during the night. But when they crept toward the menorah, they found no vessel touched, no wick trimmed. Strange hushes passed between them as they watched the lamp's cups glow with a warmth untouched by human hand. An unspoken question hung in the air. Could this be the Lord's doing? Word of the lamp's endurance leaped across the city faster than any rider. In one home, a mother hurriedly prepared a simple feast. Her children gathered at the doorway to glimpse the glow through the windows. In another courtyard, a group of elders knelt in prayer, tears glinting as they witnessed the first sign that God had not forgotten his temple. When the second dusk arrived and the oil still burned, their astonishment transformed into exultation. They sang ancient antiphons, voices echoing against marble and stone, celebrating a deliverance that surpassed even the victory of arms. As the third night fell, the miracle took on a life of its own. Pilgrims from distant villages arrived with fresh olive oil, small jars they had protected in secret, like the original flask. But the menorah did not need them. They watched as the flame held firm through the hour of deepest darkness. A traveler from Galilee knelt in reverence and touched his lips to the air, as if the fire itself delivered a kiss of divine promise. Children whispered excitedly of wonders and songs to come. Mothers clasped their babies tighter, picturing hope kindled against despair. With each successive night, the circle around the lamp grew wider. Families lit candles in every window, turning Jerusalem's slopes into a constellation of earthly stars. In narrow alleys, neighbors gathered on stoops, passing simple cakes fried in oil, an echo of the very substance that burned without end. They called them cakes of remembrance, savoring their richness and sharing stories of past sorrows and renewed faith. In one courtyard, a group of children discovered an old toy top and began to spin it on a stone slab, inventing a new game to mark each night of the miracle. The spinning top's motion, graceful and relentless, seemed to echo the unbroken flame, a small token of triumph in a time of trial. Meanwhile, within the temple chambers, the priests labored to prepare fresh consecrated oil. They pressed olives beneath the arches, their hands stained green and their lungs filling with the fruit's heady scent. They pounded the flesh of the fruit with stone mortars, harvesting every drop of juice, then filtered it through fine linen as tears of dedication fell upon the cloth. The youngest novices, their voices softened by awe, recited verses from Isaiah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. As jars filled one by one, they entrusted them to the high priest for blessing. But when they returned to light the lamp on the 9th night, they paused at the threshold, marveling to find the original flame still undimmed. For 8 nights the menorah blazed continuously, defying both expectation and the limits of human supply. That flame became the heart of Hanukkah, a word that means dedication, but speaks of so much more. A rekindling of covenant promise, a light shining in the face of oppression, a community bound by shared witness. On the final night, the entire city gathered on the Temple Mount, and Judah himself strode to the lampstand, his armor glinting in the candlelight. He lifted his sword in silent salute, acknowledging that this victory was not won by his hand alone. The crowd responded with a roar that shook ancient columns and cracked the calm of centuries. Baruch Hashem, blessed is the name. In subsequent years, pilgrims would visit families far and wide to carry the story of the oil's endurance to every hearth. In Alexandria, Jews lit menorahs in modest synagogues along the Nile. In Babylon, exiles kindled lamps beneath the domes of hidden study halls. Each flame kindled a memory of that single flask set aside in secret, of the elders who poured it out in faithful obedience, of the miracle that outshone the fiercest storm of persecution. Songs were composed, weaving the story into poetic hymns that evoked both the flicker of wicks and the surge of joy in every heart. Over centuries, the tangible light of the menorah became a beacon for intangible truths. It reminded every generation that even the smallest measure of faith, when entrusted to divine care, can outlast the darkest night. It taught that preparation and miracle coexist. Priests labored to press fresh oil, yet they trusted a power beyond their craft to sustain the flame. It proclaimed that deliverance often arrives not in the thunder of armies, but in the quiet persistence of light against shadow. Today, as families around the globe light candles in windows and share stories with shining eyes, they reenact that primordial miracle. Children spin dreidels, a playful echo of the top invented near a temple courtyard, each leftward flick marking another night of unextinguished hope. Songs once sung by firelight in ancient courts now fill modern living rooms, and the aroma of fried foods, latkes of potato, soufganiot of jelly, carries whispers of olives plucked from Judean hills. Through every candlewick's gentle glow, the miracle of the oil speaks across time. That faith, once an ember, can blaze into a beacon, guiding hearts through every age of trial and into the promise of dawn. As the morning sun cast its first golden rays over Jerusalem, the dust of battle still clung to the air around the newly cleansed temple. Priests in bright white garments moved among gleaming brass vessels, arranging fresh loaves on the golden table and trimming unblemished wicks for the menorah. Word had already spread that this rededication would be marked by a festival lasting 8 days, both to honor the swift military triumph that reclaimed the sanctuary and to commemorate the miracle of oil that defied expectation. From the highest terraces overlooking the Mount of Olives to the narrow alleyways winding through the city's heart, the hum of anticipation rose like incense. In those first 8 days, citizens and soldiers alike gathered on the Temple Mount for offerings, prayers, and feasts. Bread baked in communal ovens filled the air with warmth, while sweet wine flowed from amphorae generously poured into bowls of polished silver. Children who had only known fear now chased each other across the flagstones, laughter rising above the solemn chants of the Levites. On the courtyard steps, scribes recited the story of Mattathias' stand and Judah's leadership, ensuring that every generation born in freedom would know the names and deeds of those who had risked all. As the final day of the festival approached, elders convened beneath the shadow of the ancient cedar beam supporting the portico. They affirmed that these 8 days would recur each year as a sacred commemoration, a time when families, teachers, and travelers alike would pause to kindle lamps of remembrance. They chose the name Hanukkah, dedication, to capture both the restoration of the temple and the rededication of each heart to the covenant. And so it was that the festival took root in the very soil of Jewish identity. Within a generation, the news of Hanukkah reached Jewish communities far beyond Judea's borders. In Egypt, where Torah scrolls lined the libraries of Alexandria, synagogues carved into stone walls began to schedule special gatherings during the darkest nights of winter. From the lecterns, speakers recounted the story of the oil's endurance and the valor of the Maccabees, urging worshippers to kindle lamps in every window as beacons of hope. In Babylonian academies, scholars composed liturgies tailored for the festival. Prayers of thanksgiving, known as al-Hanisim, recited alongside the daily Amida, weaving the miracle's memory into the tapestry of worship. By the time Roman emissaries strolled through the dusty markets of Antioch or the marble colonnades of Berytus, the glow of Hanukkah candles shone behind latticed windows in homes where Hebrew had become a whispered heritage. Families gathered at twilight to light small clay lamps, their fingers careful as they placed each wick. Fathers lifted the shamash torch, the helper candle, to ignite the first lamp, a gesture symbolizing the spark of devotion that would kindle the rest. Mothers and children stood close, their faces reflecting each flicker of flame as ancient hymns rose in unison. Ma'oz Zur, Yeshuati, Rock of Ages, let our song praise your saving power. In rustic villages, farmers paused from harvesting or pruning to kindle branches of olive wood, recalling how the land itself had nourished the fighters hidden in its hills. In coastal towns along the Mediterranean, fishermen brought their fresh catch to communal tables, frying loaves of dough in olive oil to honor the miracle. These fritters, savory latkes in some places, sweet sufganiyot in others, became edible sermons, teaching that oil once destined for one day could sustain life and celebration far beyond its measured supply. Across the generations, Hanukkah evolved into a tapestry of ritual and remembrance. Children learned to play the dreidel, a four-sided top bearing Hebrew letters that spelled a mystery. Hanukkah ner ota, a miracle is its sign. Each spin echoed the uncertainty of struggle, the chance that even the smallest vessel of faith could bear witness to a divine wonder. Chocolate coins called gelt, wrapped in gold foil, became tokens of joy and the sharing of fortune, reminding each recipient that generosity and gratitude were at the festival's heart. In scholarly circles, debates flourished about whether the festival's primary focus lay in military valor, the miracle of the lamp, or the enduring message of spiritual renewal. But among ordinary people, Hanukkah settled comfortably into homes and synagogues as a season of light in the heart of winter darkness. It called families to gather against the cold, to witness each night's growing radiance, and to remember that no decree of empire, no shadow of despair could extinguish a faith that burned with divine promise. When the first Hanukkah candles are lit today, in gleaming silver menorahs on windowsills from Tel Aviv to Toronto, they connect worshipers to that first rededication in Jerusalem's temple courts. Each flame kindles a story of rededicated altars, of hidden flasks discovered by faith, of a people who rose against overwhelming odds to reclaim both territory and identity. The glow on children's faces mirrors the ancient gleam that shone through torches in dark ravines and temple chambers, drawing each generation into a living narrative. Throughout history's shifts, through exiles, persecutions, and the scattering of communities, the festival's light has remained a constant. It whispers that freedom is more than a fleeting triumph. It is a state of heart and mind that no conqueror can crush. It declares that remembrance keeps covenant alive, and that passively accepting oppression is no match for the courage inspired by a single, defiant spark. In rooms where both Hebrew and local tongues are spoken, Hanukkah's message transcends language. Through each flickering flame, it proclaims that hope endures, light conquers darkness, and faith rekindled by hands brave enough to strike a match continues to shine across centuries. As families finish the eighth night's blessings and the final candles gutter in gentle warmth, there lingers an echo of the first song sung beneath the temple's ash-scorched walls. It is a promise carried on every breath of winter wind, a pledge written anew in every soul willing to stand for freedom and devotion. In the dance of dancing flames, we see the triumph of a tiny band of fighters, the endurance of a sacred oil, and the everlasting festival born of their sacrifice. A festival that, through 8 nights each year, reminds us all that even the smallest light can illuminate the world. When the temple celebrations finally wound down and the glow of the oil's miracle dimmed in memory, a new chapter opened for Israel, one forged in the heat of victory, but fraught with the tension of newfound power. Judah the Maccabee and his brothers had driven the Seleucid yoke from Judea, but reclaiming the land proved easier than governing it. In the quiet dawn after the rededication, Mattathias's heirs found themselves standing at a crossroads. They could return to lives of service, handing authority back to the people and the priests, or they could seize the reins of state to secure the freedom they had won. The choice would shape Jewish history for generations. Simon, the eldest surviving son of Mattathias, was the first to accept the mantle of leadership beyond the battlefield. Recognized by grateful villagers and the remnant of priests in Jerusalem, he took the titles of both ethnarch, national leader, and high priest. It was a bold consolidation. In one man rested the spiritual guidance of Aaron's line and the political authority to negotiate with neighboring powers. To many, it seemed the rightful culmination of a heroic struggle. To others, it raised a troubling question. Was it prudent for a people long defined by separation of powers to vest such sweeping authority in a single house? Under Simon's rule, the Hasmoneans, named for their ancestor Hasmon, set about stabilizing the fractured realm. They rebuilt walls, refurbished roads, and renewed the temple's endowment. Yet with each fortress restored and each festival celebrated, the lines between priestly service and royal ambition blurred. Priests once content to lead worship now donned crowns. Kings once dedicated to the sword now presided over sacrifices. As the sun rose on a new era, whispers spread through Jerusalem's narrow alleys. Had the Maccabean legacy veered from sacred devotion toward secular dominion? The next generation only deepened these questions. Simon's death at the hands of insurgents brought John Hyrcanus to power, and with John came expansionist zeal. He led campaigns deep into neighboring territories, compelling Edomites to adopt circumcision and enter the covenant by force. Conquest swelled the kingdom's borders, yet forced conversion unsettled those who had once rejoiced in freedom. In homes from Jericho to Sepphoris, men debated whether coerced faith could ever mirror voluntary devotion. John's triumphs secured regional prominence, but they also sowed seeds of resentment, both within Israel and among its newly subdued neighbors. Within Jerusalem's temple precincts, factional fault lines began to show. A group of scholars and lay people who valued oral tradition and community study gathered in synagogues, what we now call the Pharisees. They argued that the written law of Moses, without the guiding light of spoken interpretation, risked calcifying into empty ritual. Each Sabbath, they met in heated debate over the finer points of purity and Sabbath observance, insisting that the living voice of tradition must shape the ever-changing circumstances of daily life. Across the marble courtyard, a rival group, soon known as the Sadducees, stood guard over the written Torah as the sole authority. Largely drawn from aristocratic priestly families, they scoffed at the Pharisees' sprawling commentaries and oral rulings. To them, Scripture's text was complete. Human additions threatened to dilute the purity of divine law. When Pharisee teachers counseled leniency for a man forced to dig in the fields on the Sabbath to feed his family, Sadducee judges rebuked them, citing the literal commandment against work. In every theological dispute, the Sadducees sought to anchor Jewish identity in what could be read with one's eyes, not whispered by generations of teachers. Meanwhile, another group retreated from the intrigues of Jerusalem altogether. The Essenes, disillusioned by both political and religious missteps, withdrew to desert communities by the Dead Sea. There they lived communally, sharing possessions, enforcing strict purity laws, and dedicating themselves to nightly study of scrolls and hymns. Their leader, known only as the Teacher of Righteousness, preached a coming judgment that would vindicate the faithful few against a corrupt priesthood and a decadent world. Though they penned no apocryphal books destined for the canon, their painstaking copies of scriptures and their vivid commentaries preserved a vision of covenant integrity untouched by royal ambition. Back in the city, factional lines hardened. Pharisees gathered in upper rooms of private homes, their debates ranging from whether a bird in flight constituted a Sabbath violation to the nuances of ritual impurity. Sadducees commanded the Sanhedrin, the high court, with authority to rule on capital cases and temple administration. Tensions flared when a Pharisee interpreter challenged a Sadducee judge on the validity of a sacrifice offered by a returning exile. The judge dismissed him and the interpreter stormed out, vowing to take the matter to popular councils. The Essenes, though physically distant, loomed large in these debates. Sadducees cited them as proof of dissent that needed containment, while Pharisees lamented their withdrawal as abandonment of Israel's communal responsibilities. As if internal disputes were not enough, the Hasmonean rulers faced pressure from beyond their borders. Neighboring Hellenistic kings eyed Judea's fertile valleys and coastal trade routes. Rome, having conquered the Greek world, cast a covetous glance toward the east. The Hasmoneans sought alliances, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through tribute, to navigate these treacherous waters. John Hyrcanus's daughter, Salome Alexandra, would later marry Aristobulus, uniting warring factions of the family, but also reigniting fierce rivalries in the royal court. Between palace intrigue and theological quarrels, the kingdom's unity frayed like an overworked tapestry. One vivid flashpoint came during a feast at the Hasmonean palace. Aristobulus, flush with victory from a campaign against the Samaritans, gathered a mixed assembly of Pharisees and Sadducees in his dining hall. As wine flowed and aromatics filled the air, he asked a series of riddles on the meaning of holiness. The Pharisees answered that holiness meant sanctifying everyday life according to the spirit of the law. The Sadducees countered that holiness derived solely from the purity of the sacrifices enshrined in the Torah. Aristobulus, irritated by their bickering, ordered both sides to stand, then dismissed them with a curt edict. "Let your disagreements not spill blood this night." Yet long after the guests departed, the insult planted fresh distrust, and old grievances simmered beneath the palace walls. Salome Alexandra's regency offered a brief respite. She embraced Pharisaic scholars, granting them seats on the Sanhedrin and funding their academies. Under her reign, the Pharisees felt empowered to enforce moral regulations in Jerusalem's markets, closing shops on the Sabbath and renewing laws against ritual impurity. The Sadducees, uneasy without royal favor, retreated to manage temple rites but found fewer adherents among the populace. Even the Essenes sensed a reprieve as Salome's policies stemmed the tide of forced Hellenization that had driven them into the desert decades before. Yet no peace could last forever. When Salome passed away, her sons Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II contested the throne and high priesthood. Pharisees favored Hyrcanus as the legitimate heir, while Sadducees backed Aristobulus's claim. Their brothers' feud spiraled into open conflict, with one brother calling upon Nabatean allies and the other appealing to Pompey, the Great of Rome. In desperation, both sides invited foreign armies into Jerusalem, Nabateans pillaging the suburbs, Romans encamped on the Mount of Olives. The Hasmonean structure, designed to protect Israel's autonomy, collapsed under the weight of internal division and external ambition. When Pompey marched into the Holy of Holies, it marked the end of Hasmonean independence. Yet even as the emperor's banners flew over the temple precincts, the debates set in motion by Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes endured. Pharisaic academies evolved into rabbinic schools that preserved oral traditions. Sadducees, now shorn of political clout, maintained the sanctity of the written law in scroll rooms. Essene texts hidden in caves would one day resurface to shed light on ancient piety. The Hasmonean era, born in righteous revolt, had given way to a new era of reflection, one where spiritual integrity would be tested not only by foreign oppression, but by the struggle to keep faith alive amid human frailty. Through the centuries, the story of the Maccabean triumph and its aftermath became a cautionary tale. Victory over external foes can be hollow unless shaped by humility and sustained by covenant fidelity. The festival of Hanukkah, born from the miracle of the oil, became a beacon of rededication each winter, an annual reminder that freedom without justice corrodes, that power unchecked invites corruption, and that a people's true strength lies in unity of purpose under the guiding hand of the divine. In lighting those 8 candles today, we honor not only the military triumph of our ancestors, but the deeper victory of a faith that endures amid triumphs and trials alike. The glow of Hanukkah candles casts long, flickering shadows across city squares, where activists of every creed gather to invoke the flame of courage first kindled in ancient Jerusalem. In one modern clip, a group of university students stands behind a towering menorah as they light the first candle on a frigid December evening. Their breath clouds the night, but their resolve burns bright. They are not merely commemorating a miracle of oil, but declaring their right to worship freely, to assemble in peace, and to resist forces that would silence their voices. Nearby, a banner unfurls, "Religious freedom for all." The scene shifts to another country, where dissidents in disguise slip into an underground synagogue to kindle candles beneath watchful eyes. Their whispered prayers echo the defiance of Mattathias's rallying cry, "Whoever is for the Lord, follow me," transformed now into a universal call for conscience over coercion. Across classrooms in schools from New York to Nairobi, teachers guide children through animated retellings of the Maccabean Revolt. Little hands trace the oil-laden jars hidden in caves, and eyes grow wide at the image of a single day's lamp burning 8 nights. But lessons go beyond history. Educators pause the story to ask students how they might stand up for others whose rights are threatened, or to consider the meaning of steadfast faith when laws criminalize belief. A middle schooler raises her hand. "What would I do if I had to choose between obeying my conscience and obeying a law?" In those moments, Hanukkah becomes more than a festival of lights. It becomes a living curriculum in moral courage, a reminder that the smallest flame of conviction can light the darkest night of oppression. In interfaith gatherings, candles of multiple shapes and colors stand side by side. A mosque courtyard hosts a joint Muslim-Jewish celebration, where participants offer dates and dried fruits alongside donuts fried in olive oil. Each sweet bite a nod to the miracle that transcends boundaries. Across the street, a Christian pastor stands among Jewish elders, lifting a chalice of wine and declaring solidarity and religious liberty. Their voices mingle in a spontaneous hymn that borrows from psalms of deliverance and verses of universal hope. In these moments, Hanukkah's echo reaches beyond communal identity and speaks to a shared yearning that every soul has a right to worship, to question, to believe without fear. In city parks and bustling plazas, human rights advocates draw upon the imagery of the Maccabees to frame modern struggles. When a community faces forced closures of houses of worship, organizers erect menorahs at midnight, their candles piercing the haze of tear gas and battered shields. Photographers capture the contrast of white-clad worshipers standing firm before lines of riot police, a tableau that recalls rebel warriors hidden in Judean hills, striking fear into an empire's heart. Social media amplifies these images. Hashtags like "Sure Shall Light the Night" and "Freedom Festival" trend across platforms, calling on people worldwide to light a candle in their own windows, to bear witness that tyranny cannot extinguish collective resolve. Refugee camps tell their own stories of Hanukkah's legacy. A family fleeing conflict in their homeland arrives at a temporary shelter, scarred by loss but determined to hold on to heritage. Volunteers gather scraps of fabric to fashion makeshift menorahs, improvising with aluminum cans and olive oil drip from shared tins. As night falls, they kindle their first candle beneath a tarp, the flame dancing across tear-streaked faces. Children clutch clay dreidels spun from salvaged clay, their laughter rising above the camp's lullabies. In that fragile sanctuary, Hanukkah becomes a lifeline to identity, a reminder that even displaced hearts can carry a covenant's promise into exile. Meanwhile, in halls of government and chambers of law, legislators invoke the Maccabean narrative when drafting bills to protect religious minorities. A senator recounts ancient scrolls by candlelight, arguing that the very idea of compelled worship betrayed the founding covenant of communal autonomy. Debates echo with references to Hanukkah's light as a symbol of freedom from both foreign conquerors and domestic intolerance. Advocates cite the festival's story in white paper reports, urging the passage of laws to safeguard houses of worship, to enshrine conscience rights, and to ensure that no creed is forced into silence. As the festival's glow continues to spread, entrepreneurs and artists find inspiration in its themes. Galleries exhibit installations of kinetic light sculptures that mimic the undulating dance of oil-lit wicks. Poets compose verses about the single lamp that shone 8 nights, weaving lines of ancient Hebrew with modern idioms of resistance. Filmmakers trace the arc from Mattathias's defiance to present-day whistleblowers and truth-tellers, drawing parallels between clandestine scroll hiding and encrypted messages shared by activists online. In every medium, Hanukkah's flame transcends text to become an emblem of human agency, the power to assert dignity in the face of imposed darkness. Across the globe, diasporic communities adapt the festival to local contexts, underscoring its universal resonance. In Tokyo's Jewish Center, families light blue and white candles from an illuminated menorah perched beside bonsai trees, blending traditions in soft harmony. In Cape Town, South African Jews gather on beaches at sunset, singing hymns to the rhythm of ocean waves and sharing braai fare alongside oil-fried treats. In Vancouver, Sikh and Jewish youth collaborate on street art murals depicting menorahs intertwined with ikonks, symbols of unity and mutual respect. Each collaboration affirms that the heart of Hanukkah lies not in a single cultural expression, but in the message that devotion and solidarity transcend barriers of language, geography, and creed. Educational initiatives stretch further still, with museums and heritage centers hosting immersive Hanukkah exhibits. Visitors descend into dimly lit vaults where replica jars of oil sit beside authentic fragments of Second Temple ceramics. Interactive stations allow guests to spin digital dreidels and test their knowledge of the Maccabean Revolt's key players. Curators pair ancient artifacts with modern testimonials, video interviews of refugees lighting candles in war zones, or faith leaders from majority Muslim countries recounting quiet Hanukkah celebrations in their own homes. The exhibit's narrative arc underscores one truth: that courage's flame, once ignited in a narrow Judean valley, now illuminates hearts across every civilization. In quieter moments, individuals draw privately on Hanukkah's legacy to anchor personal struggles. A teacher facing censorship for discussing religious history in a secular classroom lights a candlestick at his desk each evening, reciting the ancient blessing as a pledge to truth. An immigrant nurse smuggles a small menorah into a hospital break room, sharing the light with fellow workers on long, lonely nights. A climate activist perched atop a glacier, filming a candlelit vigil against a backdrop of melting ice, invokes the miracle of oil as a plea for stewardship of creation. In these solitary gestures, Hanukkah's spirit breathes new life into private resistance, reminding every seeker that small acts of faith echo across the grand tapestry of history. As the centuries unfold, the festival's legacy remains as vivid as ever, not only in the ritual of lighting candles, but in the enduring testament to courage, faith, and the universal right to live and worship without coercion. Each time a family gathers around a menorah, an activist stands before a podium, a student asks difficult questions in a classroom, or a stranger offers a helping hand in solidarity, they draw from the ancient wellspring of Hanukkah's light. They affirm that tyranny may press its heel on the neck of freedom, but it cannot quench the flicker of hope born in a time of exile and oppression. And so, in the dance of 8 glowing flames, we find a mirror for every human yearning. To be remembered, to be heard, to be free. We see in that single flash miracle a promise that when faith is kindled, it can outlast empires and enlighten souls across time. The legacy of the Maccabees and the Festival of Lights stands as a beacon for every generation, calling us to stand firm in our convictions, to act with compassion for the oppressed, and to kindle our own lights, however small, against the darkness of injustice. Through courage, faith, and unwavering hope, each of us carries forward a flame that no night can overcome. As the last flame flickers against the evening sky, pause for a moment and let its gentle glow settle in your heart. Hanukkah's miracle wasn't merely a military triumph or a clever guerrilla campaign. It was a vivid reminder that when faith is nurtured, it can shine far beyond any single day. Think of the challenges you faced, moments when circumstances seemed impossible, yet you found strength in a single act of kindness or a quiet prayer. That spark of hope, like the oil that burned for 8 nights, endures when we refuse to let fear extinguish it. When families gather around a glowing menorah, whether in a grand hall or a humble living room, they celebrate more than an ancient victory. They honor the courage to stand firm in conviction, the power of community to sustain one another, and the promise that even the smallest light can lead us through the darkest times. In your own life, where might you kindle that kind of light? Perhaps it's speaking up for someone in need, offering a gesture of compassion to a stranger, or simply refusing to give in to despair when the road ahead feels uncertain. If today's journey stirred something within you, I invite you to join our community here at Biblical Journey. We explore stories of faith and resilience from across the ages, always seeking the lessons they hold for our own lives. Subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss our next adventure into history's hidden corners, and it helps this channel continue sharing these timeless narratives. I'd also love to hear from you. What does Hanukkah's miracle mean in your story? Share a thought or a memory in the comments below. Your words may light the way for someone else who needs encouragement today. And if a friend or family member would find inspiration in this message, pass it along so they too can remember that hope shines brightest when we share it. Thank you for spending these moments with us, letting the flame of ancient faith cast its warmth into our present lives. May your own light grow as you carry forward the spirit of dedication and sacrificial love that Hanukkah celebrates. Until our next biblical journey, keep that flame alive in your heart and let its promise guide every step you take.